Sauron, the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, is one of the most fearsome and ancient entities in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings universe. His malevolent influence spans millennia, shaping the history and fate of the world. But what if the free peoples of Middle-earth had failed to stop him? What if the ring had not been destroyed and Sauron emerged victorious? In this video, we'll explore the origins of Sauron's rise, his reign of terror, and what the world might have looked like under his dominion. Sauron's origins are deeply rooted in the very fabric of Tolkien's legendarium. Before he became the Dark Lord that terrorized Middle-earth, he was known as Mairon, a Maya, a powerful spirit of the same order as Gandalf and Saruman, yet initially dedicated to crafting and order. Mairon served the Vala Aule, the master of craftsmanship, metal, and creation. Under Aule, Mairon honed his skills in shaping and controlling the physical world, finding immense satisfaction in the pursuit of perfection and efficiency. His ambition, however, was his downfall. Mairon's drive for order led him down a dark path when he encountered Melkor, later known as Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Unlike Aule, who was content with creating and sharing beauty, Melkor sought dominion over all things, wishing to reshape the world according to his own desires. Mairon was captivated by this vision. He admired Melkor's raw power and believed that through submission to him, he could bring about the order he craved, albeit at the cost of freedom for others. Thus, Mairon abandoned Aule and aligned himself with Melkor, becoming his most trusted lieutenant and adopting a new name, Sauron. Under Morgoth's command, Sauron's powers grew. His natural abilities in craft and manipulation were twisted to serve darker purposes. He became a master of deceit, sorcery, and domination, playing a key role in Morgoth's efforts to subjugate the world during the First Age. During this period, Sauron developed a cunning intellect, preferring subtle manipulation over brute force. His ability to inspire fear, bend others to his will, and command vast armies made him indispensable to Morgoth's cause. Throughout the First Age, Sauron's influence spread, especially in the kingdom of Beleriand, where he commanded fortresses and armies in the name of his master. One of his greatest achievements during this time was the conquest of the island of Tol Sirion, which he transformed into a base of operations called Tol Ingarhoth, or the Isle of Werewolves. From this dark fortress, he controlled an army of monstrous creatures, most notably his werewolves, whom he had bred and empowered with his dark magic. Sauron's use of corruption, terror, and control during this period foreshadowed the methods he would later employ in his attempts to conquer Middle-earth on his own. But Sauron was not invincible during the First Age. His most notable defeat came when he faced the Elven Lord Finrod Felagund and the mortal Beren in a battle of songs of power, a contest of wills and enchantments. Though Sauron won the encounter, he later faced defeat at the hands of the Hound Huan, who, along with Luthien, forced him to surrender his stronghold. This rare moment of vulnerability showed that Sauron, while immensely powerful, was not immune to the courage and valor of Middle-earth's heroes. When Morgoth was finally overthrown by the Valar at the end of the First Age, Sauron initially fled and hid. But unlike many of his master's servants, Sauron did not seek to disappear forever. He feigned repentance before Eönwë, the herald of the Valar, in a bid to avoid punishment. However, fearing true judgment and not ready to relinquish his desire for control, Sauron escaped into the shadows. The end of Morgoth's reign marked the beginning of Sauron's rise to power in his own right, setting the stage for his next great conquest. Following the defeat of Morgoth, the world entered the Second Age, a time of relative peace and rebuilding. But for Sauron, it was a time of opportunity. The absence of his former master left a power vacuum that he was eager to fill. With Morgoth gone, Sauron became the most powerful remaining force of evil in Middle-earth, and he wasted no time in rebuilding his strength. During the early Second Age, Sauron worked in secret, building his power base in the east and south of Middle-earth. Over time, he grew bolder, and by the middle of the Second Age, he had decided to take a different approach to conquest. Instead of using outright force, he would use deception. Sauron had learned much from his time under Morgoth, particularly about the power of manipulation and the potential of seducing others to his will. To this end, he took on a fair and wise form, disguising himself as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Under this guise, Sauron approached the elves of Eregion, offering to teach them the secrets of forging powerful magical artifacts. The elves, particularly Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor, were eager to learn, and under Sauron's guidance, they forged the Rings of Power. These rings were designed to enhance the abilities of the wearers, granting them great power over the natural world, longevity, and influence. However, Sauron had a darker purpose in mind. In secret, Sauron crafted a ring of his own, the One Ring, in the fires of Mount Doom. This ring was the Master Ring, designed to control the others. Through the One Ring, Sauron intended to dominate the minds of the ring-bearers, bending them to his will and extending his influence over all the free peoples of Middle-earth. But the elves, who were perceptive and wise, quickly realized Sauron's treachery the moment he put on the One Ring. They hid their own 3 rings, which Sauron had no direct control over, and war erupted between Sauron and the elves. Sauron was furious at this betrayal and waged a brutal campaign to conquer the Elven realms. He destroyed Eregion, and Celebrimbor was captured and killed. Though the elves had managed to keep their 3 rings out of Sauron's grasp, many of the other rings fell into his hands, which he later distributed to men and dwarves, corrupting them over time. The men who accepted the rings became the Nazgul, or Ringwraiths, immortal servants of Sauron bound to his will through the power of the One Ring. Sauron's influence continued to grow throughout the Second Age, and eventually he declared himself the ruler of Middle-earth. His armies of orcs, men, and other dark creatures began to overrun much of the land. This period culminated in the War of the Last Alliance, where the forces of men and elves, led by Elendil and Gil-galad, marched against Sauron in a desperate bid to stop his conquest. The war was long and costly, and though Sauron was finally defeated in single combat by Isildur, who cut the One Ring from his hand, the ring itself was not destroyed. Isildur claimed it for himself, and Sauron's spirit survived, retreating into the shadows once again, waiting for the moment he could reclaim his full strength. In the Third Age, Sauron's power was greatly diminished, but his influence never truly waned. After his defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance, Sauron spent centuries regaining his strength in secret, biding his time. His spirit lingered in the world, and while many believed him to be gone for good, his presence was felt through his servants and dark works. For much of the early Third Age, Sauron worked in secret, seeking to rebuild his strength and find the One Ring, which had been lost after Isildur's death. Without the ring, Sauron's power was greatly reduced, but with it, he could become unstoppable. During this time, he also influenced the kingdom of Numenor, leading to its eventual downfall. His corruption of the Númenóreans began subtly, using promises of immortality and power to turn them away from the Valar and toward worship of Morgoth. This culminated in the destruction of Númenor, but Sauron himself survived, returning to Middle-earth with renewed ambition. By the middle of the Third Age, Sauron had taken up residence in Dol Guldur, a fortress in Mirkwood, where he worked under the guise of the Necromancer. It was here that he slowly gathered his strength, working behind the scenes to sow discord and prepare for his eventual return. His influence over the lands of men, particularly in the kingdoms of Harad and Rhûn, grew, and he built alliances with many dark forces. Despite the efforts of the White Council, including figures like Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel, who worked to uncover his true identity, Sauron managed to avoid detection for centuries. It wasn't until the late Third Age, with the discovery of the One Ring in the Shire, that Sauron began to openly declare his return. His search for the ring became the driving force of his actions, and his influence spread rapidly, culminating in the War of the Ring. Sauron's primary goal during this period was to reclaim the One Ring and use its power to dominate Middle-earth once more. The Dark Lord's forces laid siege to Gondor and Rohan, and his armies of orcs, trolls, and men seemed unstoppable. However, despite his vast power and the terror he inspired, Sauron's fate was tied to the ring. When Frodo Baggins, with the help of Samwise Gamgee, finally destroyed the One Ring by casting it into the fires of Mount Doom, Sauron was defeated once and for all. His physical form was destroyed, and his spirit was dispersed, never to rise again. As the Third Age progressed, Sauron's presence in Middle-earth grew increasingly menacing. Though his physical form had been destroyed at the end of the Second Age, during the War of the Last Alliance, his spirit lingered, unable to fully fade because the One Ring had not been destroyed. For much of the early Third Age, Sauron was a shadow of his former self, working in secret to regain his strength and searching relentlessly for the One Ring, the source of his power. Without it, he could not fully manifest his dominance, but with it, he could become unstoppable. The One Ring had been lost after Isildur's death, and for centuries, it remained hidden from both Sauron and the rest of the world. The ring passed into legend, with many believing it had been lost forever in the depths of the Anduin River. During this time, Sauron's influence began to subtly infiltrate the world of men, elves, and dwarves. His servants, including the 9 Nazgul, searched for the ring under his command, but the Dark Lord also needed to consolidate his strength elsewhere. At the beginning of the Third Age, Sauron operated under a veil of secrecy, using the guise of the Necromancer to establish himself in Dol Guldur, a stronghold located in the heart of Mirkwood. From this fortress, Sauron worked in the shadows, building his power base and spreading his influence throughout Middle-earth. During this period, many of the Free Peoples were unaware that the shadow growing in the east was indeed the spirit of Sauron, returned and biding his time. Even the wise, including Gandalf and the White Council, initially did not suspect that the Necromancer was, in fact, the Dark Lord. Through Dol Guldur, Sauron worked to destabilize the world. His influence caused the darkening of Mirkwood, turning the once great forest into a place of fear and dread. His forces began to gather strength, with orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures massing under his command. The southern lands of Middle-earth, including Harad and Rhûn, fell further under his sway, with their kings and chieftains entering into dark alliances with him. In these lands, Sauron spread his dominion, ensuring that when the time came, he would have armies ready to march at his command. Sauron's ultimate goal during the Third Age was singular: to find the One Ring. He knew that the ring would grant him complete dominion over Middle-earth, allowing him to control the wills of others and complete the subjugation of the Free Peoples. Yet, for centuries, the ring remained lost. However, fate would intervene when, in the year 2463 of the Third Age, the One Ring was discovered by a creature named Smeagol, who would later be known as Gollum. Smeagol found the ring in the riverbed of the Anduin, not far from where Isildur had been slain long ago. Unbeknownst to Sauron, the ring had resurfaced, beginning a series of events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Smeagol kept the ring for many centuries, hiding in the dark caves of the Misty Mountains, where the ring slowly corrupted him, extending his life unnaturally and turning him into a twisted, wretched creature. While Smeagol remained hidden, Sauron's search for the ring continued, though he was unaware of its proximity. During this time, Sauron's power continued to grow, as did his knowledge of the world. He dispatched the Nazgul to search the lands for clues about the ring's whereabouts, and his spies were active across Middle-earth, gathering intelligence and laying the groundwork for his return. It wasn't until Gandalf the Grey began to suspect that the necromancer of Dol Guldur was, in fact, Sauron, that the White Council acted. Led by Saruman, who was secretly plotting his own rise to power, the White Council drove Sauron from Dol Guldur in 2941 of the Third Age. However, this was only a temporary setback for the Dark Lord. Sauron had already been preparing for a greater return to power, and after being expelled from Dol Guldur, he returned to his ancient stronghold of Barad-dûr in Mordor, where he openly declared himself. Now that Sauron had returned to Mordor, he began to mobilize his forces in earnest. His armies of orcs and trolls swelled in numbers, and he forged new alliances with the Easterlings and the Suthrons of Harad. The 9 Nazgûl, his most loyal servants, resumed their search for the One Ring with renewed vigor. Sauron knew that time was running short, and his power continued to grow. By the time of his return to Barad-dûr, he was capable of manipulating the politics of the surrounding realms, spreading fear and division among his enemies. Meanwhile, in the Quiet Shire, the ring had come into the possession of Bilbo Baggins, though neither Bilbo nor Sauron initially understood the significance of this discovery. The ring, which had been dormant for centuries, now found itself in the hands of a hobbit, far from the grasp of the Dark Lord. However, the ring's influence had not faded. Though Bilbo held the ring without immediate consequence, its power began to exert a subtle influence over him, as it had with Gollum before him. The longer Bilbo kept the ring, the more it began to corrupt him, although not to the same extent as it had with Gollum. It was Gandalf who began to suspect the true nature of Bilbo's ring. Over time, he pieced together clues from ancient lore and his own observations, leading him to investigate further. Eventually, through a series of revelations, Gandalf realized that Bilbo's ring was, in fact, the One Ring, the key to Sauron's power. Armed with this knowledge, Gandalf urged Bilbo to leave the ring behind, setting the stage for Frodo Baggins, Bilbo's nephew, to become the ring-bearer. By this time, Sauron's power had grown to near its former height, and he had fully re-established himself as the Dark Lord. His fortress of Barad-dûr was rebuilt, towering over the land of Mordor, and his armies of orcs, Easterlings, Haradrim and trolls were poised to march against Gondor and the Free Peoples. The Dark Tower of Barad-dûr became a symbol of Sauron's renewed might, and his gaze, ever watchful, was fixed upon finding the One Ring. The Eye of Sauron, an all-seeing, malevolent force, constantly scanned the lands for any sign of the ring's whereabouts. This eye became the emblem of his rule, a source of terror for all who opposed him. During the War of the Ring, Sauron's forces launched devastating attacks on Rohan and Gondor, aiming to weaken the last strongholds of resistance. His strategy was one of overwhelming force, combined with psychological warfare, spreading fear and despair among his enemies. The siege of Minas Tirith was the pinnacle of this strategy, as Sauron unleashed his armies in a full-scale assault on Gondor's capital. The city nearly fell under the weight of his onslaught, and hope seemed all but lost for the Free Peoples. Yet even as Sauron waged war on the battlefield, his attention was divided. He knew that the One Ring was key to his ultimate victory. If he could recover it, none could oppose him. However, Sauron's greatest flaw was his inability to conceive that anyone would seek to destroy the ring. In his mind, the power of the ring was too great for any to resist, and he assumed that whoever possessed it would eventually try to use it against him. This assumption shaped much of Sauron's strategy during the War of the Ring. He believed that his enemies would try to wield the ring themselves, and he focused his efforts on finding the new ring-bearer, unaware that Frodo Baggins was on a perilous journey to Mount Doom to destroy it. Frodo's journey was the culmination of Sauron's worst fears, though he did not know it. As the hobbits made their way through Mordor, Sauron remained fixated on Gondor and Rohan, directing his forces in their direction. His eye, while vast in its reach, was blind to the small, seemingly insignificant figures making their way toward the heart of his power. It was this very blindness that allowed Frodo and Samwise to reach the slopes of Mount Doom. In the end, Sauron's downfall came not through the power of armies or great acts of heroism on the battlefield, but through the destruction of the One Ring. As Frodo, with the help of Gollum, cast the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, the very foundation of Sauron's power was undone. His spirit, tied irrevocably to the ring, was shattered. Barad-dûr collapsed, and his armies, once held together by his will, were thrown into disarray. Without the ring, Sauron's physical form could never be restored, and his spirit was cast into the void, never to rise again. Sauron's struggle for the One Ring was the driving force of his actions throughout the Third Age. His failure to recover it ultimately led to his complete defeat and the liberation of Middle-earth from his shadow. His downfall marked the end of the Third Age and the beginning of a new era, free from the tyranny of the Dark Lord, who had long cast his shadow over the land. Imagining a world where Sauron emerges victorious in the War of the Ring opens a bleak and terrifying vision of Middle-earth's future. The Dark Lord's triumph would not have been a simple military victory. It would have been the complete and utter domination of all life under his iron rule. With the One Ring back in his possession, Sauron's power would have become unmatched, and the very fabric of Middle-earth would have been reshaped into a world of darkness, cruelty, and despair. To understand what this world might look like, we must first consider the nature of the One Ring and its role in Sauron's domination. The ring was not just a powerful artifact, it was an extension of Sauron's very will. With it, he could exert control over the minds of others, especially the bearers of the other rings of power. The elves, dwarves, and men who wore these rings would have fallen under his sway, their free will erased, their minds bent to serve the Dark Lord's ambitions. Even the most powerful beings, such as Elrond, Galadriel, and the other leaders of the Free Peoples, would have been subject to his control. With the One Ring, Sauron would have been able to dominate the entire world, enforcing a totalitarian rule where resistance was impossible. One of the first and most obvious effects of Sauron's victory would be the complete destruction of the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan. Without the intervention of the ring's destruction at Mount Doom, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields would have ended in disaster for Gondor. The forces of Mordor, led by the Witch King of Angmar, would have overrun Minas Tirith, killing its defenders and leaving the White City in flames. Aragorn, Gandalf, and their allies would have fallen in battle, and with them, the last hope of resistance. The armies of Mordor, bolstered by the legions of orcs, trolls, Easterlings, and Haradrim, would have swept across the lands of Gondor, slaughtering or enslaving its people. With Gondor in ruins, Rohan would have soon followed. The riders of Rohan, who fought valiantly at Helm's Deep and in the fields outside Minas Tirith, would have been unable to withstand the might of Sauron's armies. The Golden Hall of Meduseld in Edoras would have been burned to the ground, and the Rohirrim, renowned for their bravery and their horses, would have been exterminated or reduced to a subjugated people, forced to serve the Dark Lord. The fertile fields of Rohan would have been turned into desolate, ash-covered wastelands, much like the plains of Gorgoroth in Mordor. In the north, the elven realms of Rivendell and Lothlorien would have faced a similar fate. Sauron's hatred for the elves, particularly those who had opposed him for millennia, was deep and personal. He would have spared no effort in destroying their ancient kingdoms. Rivendell, the hidden refuge of Elrond, would have been found and razed to the ground. The wisdom and knowledge accumulated by the elves over thousands of years would have been lost, and the few survivors would have been hunted down or enslaved. Lothlorien, the enchanted realm of Galadriel and Celeborn, would have suffered a more tragic end. The power of Galadriel's ring, Nenya, had preserved Lothlorien as a place of beauty and light in an increasingly dark world. But once Sauron reclaimed the One Ring, the power of the Elven rings would have faded. Lothlorien's golden woods would have withered and died, and the elves who lived there would have either fled or been exterminated. The once glorious realm would have become a barren wasteland, a testament to Sauron's dominance over all that was once fair and good in Middle-earth. The Shire, the peaceful homeland of the hobbits, would not have escaped Sauron's reach. Though the Shire was far removed from the great battles of the south, Sauron's victory would have ensured that no corner of Middle-earth remained untouched by his darkness. With the ringwraiths patrolling the lands and the forces of Mordor expanding their reach, the Shire would have fallen under occupation. The hobbits, known for their love of peace, farming, and simple pleasures, would have been utterly unprepared for the brutality of Sauron's rule. Their lands would have been plundered, their crops taken to feed the ever-growing armies of Mordor, and their people enslaved or killed. Under Sauron's reign, Middle-earth would have become a land of unending darkness. The natural world itself would have been twisted and corrupted by his presence. The lands of Gondor, Rohan, and the Shire, once green and vibrant, would have been transformed into wastelands reminiscent of Mordor. Dead, blackened landscapes where nothing could grow. The very air would have become foul and oppressive, filled with the stench of decay and smoke from the forges of Sauron's vast war machine. The men, elves and dwarves who survived Sauron's conquest would have faced a fate worse than death. Those who did not fall in battle or managed to flee into the farthest, most desolate corners of the world would have been enslaved. Sauron had long used slavery as a tool of domination, forcing orcs, trolls and men to serve in his armies and work in his forges. Under his total control, the free peoples of Middle-earth would have been reduced to nothing more than cogs in the Dark Lord's vast machine, toiling endlessly to feed his empire. Freedom, joy, and creativity, all the things that made Middle-earth a place of wonder, would have been extinguished under Sauron's rule. Beyond the immediate subjugation of Middle-earth's peoples, Sauron's influence would have spread to the very fabric of time itself. As a Maya, Sauron possessed an inherent understanding of the world's natural order and the flow of history. With the One Ring, he would have gained control over the other rings of power, including those worn by the dwarves. Though the dwarves were more resistant to domination, their kingdoms would have eventually fallen. Sauron's control over the dwarven rings would have allowed him to corrupt their hearts, turning them into greedy, isolated creatures. The great dwarven cities like Erebor and the mines of Moria would have been stripped of their treasures and left as haunted tombs, inhabited only by the ghosts of their former glory. Even the immortal elves, who had long resisted Sauron's influence, would have faced a slow and agonizing decline. Without the power of their rings to preserve their realms, they would have been forced to either submit to Sauron's rule or flee across the sea to the Undying Lands. However, even the Valinor across the sea might not have been safe from Sauron's reach. The Dark Lord's hunger for power was insatiable, and with the One Ring, he might have sought to extend his dominion beyond Middle-earth, attempting to challenge the Valar themselves. Though this is speculative, it is clear that Sauron's ambitions knew no bounds, and he would not have stopped until he controlled everything, both in Middle-earth and beyond. The spiritual and cultural impact of Sauron's victory would have been profound. Middle-earth had long been a place of cultural richness, where the histories, languages, and art of different peoples flourished. Under Sauron's dominion, this diversity would have been crushed. The Dark Lord had no interest in preserving the beauty or wisdom of the world. His goal was absolute control. The histories of the free peoples would have been erased, their languages forgotten, and their art destroyed. The only culture that would have remained would have been one of fear and obedience to Sauron. His symbols, particularly the Eye of Sauron, would have replaced all other emblems, and the very idea of resistance would have been stamped out. One of the most horrifying aspects of Sauron's potential rule is how complete his control over life and death would have been. With the One Ring, Sauron had power over the very essence of existence. He could have extended the lives of his servants unnaturally, just as he did with the Nazgûl, creating more wraith-like beings bound to his will. The natural cycle of life and death would have been disrupted, with those in Sauron's service trapped in a twisted half-life, existing only to serve his purposes. This perversion of nature would have spread across all of Middle-earth, leaving a world where death was not a release, but a continuation of torment under the Dark Lord's gaze. In this dark future, hope would have been extinguished. The light of Valinor, the wisdom of the elves, the courage of men, and the resilience of the dwarves would all have been crushed under Sauron's boot. The very concept of rebellion would have become impossible, as Sauron's control over the minds and wills of the people would have been absolute. The world would have entered a new dark age, one that might never have ended, as Sauron's rule was designed to be eternal, upheld by the power of the One Ring. In essence, a Middle-earth where Sauron won the War of the Ring would have been a place devoid of all the qualities that made the world beautiful and worth fighting for. It would have been a world of endless night, where fear reigned supreme and where the only law was the will of the Dark Lord. Every living thing, from the smallest hobbit to the mightiest elf, would have lived under the oppressive shadow of Sauron's tyranny, forever trapped in a world of darkness and despair.